I didn't know my marriage would begin to die the night I sat alone in a restaurant for 3 hours, wearing a dress I had chosen just for him, watching strangers try not to stare at me with pity. I had always believed betrayal would be loud, shouting, slammed doors, obvious affairs. I never imagined it would come disguised as laughter, entitlement, and a man who truly believed I didn't understand the world I had quietly built for him. I'm 34 years old, and for 6 years of my marriage, I was the invisible architect behind my husband's success. I built bridges he walked across. I opened doors he never knew were unlocked for him, and I let him believe, willingly, that everything he achieved was his alone. That night, on our anniversary, I arrived early. I sat straight-backed at our table. I told the waiter I was waiting for my husband. Again and again. I checked my phone until my hands went numb. No calls, no texts, just silence stretching so long it became humiliation. By the time he finally walked in, laughing, drunk, surrounded by his friends, I already knew something had broken. But what shattered me wasn't the weight. It was the way he smiled at me like I was small. It was the joke he made at my expense. It was the moment I realized that the man who owed his career, his credibility, and his confidence to years of my unseen labor believed I was lucky to be sitting at his table at all. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him in front of his friends. I went home. And while he slept, I made a series of quiet phone calls that would unravel everything he thought he had built on his own. People like to say I destroyed my husband's business out of spite. That isn't true. I simply stopped holding it up. What followed wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And it didn't end with my marriage. It exposed a second betrayal I never saw coming, one that would tear apart my parents' marriage and force me to choose who I was willing to protect and who I was finally willing to let fall. This isn't a story about a missed dinner. It's about what happens when a woman removes her silence and the world realizes how much weight she was carrying alone. I'm going to back up, because if you only saw the anniversary night, the restaurant, the 3-hour wait, the way Caleb strolled in like my time was something he could spend, you might think my reaction afterward was extreme. But people always say that when they only witness the explosion and never the slow leak of gas that filled the house for years. I was 28 when I met Caleb. At the time, I was already established. More than that, I was grounded. I worked as a marketing director at my father's advertising firm, the kind of agency people whispered about in our city like it was a private club. My father had built it from nothing over 3 decades. Long nights, canceled vacations, hands stained with printer ink and coffee, the kind of work ethic you can't fake. I grew up in that world. Not as a spoiled daughter, sitting in an office with a title she didn't earn. My father wouldn't have allowed it, even if I wanted it. I learned the business the way other kids learned piano. I learned how to read a room, how to listen for what people weren't saying, how to position an idea so it felt inevitable. By the time I met Caleb, I had already spent 6 years climbing my way up, handling major accounts, leading teams, attending client dinners, where I smiled until my cheeks ached, then came home and revised strategy decks until midnight. And Caleb? Caleb was 30, charming in a restless way, the kind of man who spoke with his hands, who looked past you while talking like he was watching his future play out on a screen only he could see. He was working odd jobs at the time, retail, sales, things that kept the lights on but didn't fit the image he had of himself. He would talk constantly about his tech company someday. His idea, when he finally told me, was actually good. A software platform for small businesses to manage customer relationships, ACRM. Not groundbreaking, but useful, practical, a real problem with a real solution. But there was a gap between idea and execution, and Caleb lived inside that gap like it was a studio apartment he refused to leave. He came from a different kind of family. His parents were middle-class teachers, retired on modest pensions. They were good people, from what I saw, polite, kind, a little cautious with their smiles. They didn't throw money at problems because they didn't have money to throw. They had stability, not leverage. The first months of dating were easy. Caleb would pick me up in a used sedan that smelled faintly like cologne and stale fast food, and he'd take me to cheap restaurants he swore were hidden gems. He'd lean forward across the table, eyes bright, telling me what he wanted to build, what he wanted to become. And I'll admit it, there was something intoxicating about being looked at like that. Like I was the person he wanted beside him when he finally became the man he believed he was meant to be. I told myself it was love, and maybe it was, but it was also hope, narrative, the allure of potential. The first year we dated, Caleb quit his retail job. Just quit. No safety net, no plan, no backup offer. He called it taking the leap. He moved into a small studio apartment and spent months building a prototype, hunched over his laptop like he was trying to force the future to exist through sheer willpower. At first, I admired it. Then his savings ran out. And that's where the dynamic shifted, quietly, like a chair leg snapping under a table, but no one noticing until the next time someone leans on it. It started small. I paid for dinners more often because he said, it's temporary. I covered weekend trips because he said, once the company takes off, I'll spoil you. I noticed his rent creeping into conversation. Little comments like, my landlord's being a jerk, or, this month is tight, said with a laugh, like it was all part of the adventure. Until one night he said it directly. I might need help this month. I remember sitting on my couch, my laptop open, work emails blinking at the corner of my screen, and looking at him. This grown man who spoke like a future CEO but had the finances of a teenager. I should have said no, or at least I should have asked questions, details, timelines. Instead, I said okay, because I loved him, because I didn't want to be the kind of woman who crushed someone's dream by being practical, because honestly, I could afford it. And when you can afford something, you tell yourself it isn't a sacrifice, that it doesn't matter. But the truth is, it matters the moment the other person starts to believe they're entitled to it. Caleb promised he'd pay me back. He always did. He would kiss my forehead, squeeze my hand, and say, "You're my biggest supporter." And at that stage, it sounded romantic, not like a warning. When we got engaged, my father asked me to meet him for lunch. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't demand I call off the wedding. He didn't insult Caleb. My father was too controlled for that. He just watched me carefully across the table and said, "He seems like a good man." Then he paused. "But I don't know if he's disciplined." That word, disciplined. It stung because I knew exactly what my father meant. You can be smart. You can be charming. You can have ideas. But discipline is what turns ideas into reality. I defended Caleb, of course. I said he just needed time, resources, the right connections. My father sighed, the way a man sighs when he knows you've already made up your mind. "I trust you," he said. "Just be careful." I told myself I was. I told myself love meant believing in someone even when the world didn't. And then Caleb and I got married. And he was still struggling. His platform had beta users, people testing it for free, but no paying customers. He applied to accelerators, pitched to investor groups, got rejected again and again. I watched the frustration build in him like pressure in a sealed container. He would pace, he would get short-tempered. He would snap at little things, then apologize and blame stress. And I could see it, clear as day. He wasn't just afraid of failing. He was afraid of being ordinary. So I started making moves behind the scenes. I didn't do it because I wanted credit. I did it because I wanted stability. Because I had married this man, and I believed if I could just get him over the first hill, he would run on his own. My father had connections throughout the business community, and I asked him, carefully at first, to introduce Caleb to potential clients who might benefit from his platform. My father hesitated. Then, because he loved me more than he distrusted Caleb, he agreed. Those introductions landed Caleb his first 3 paying customers, and Caleb was ecstatic. He came home, flushed with pride, talking about his sales ability, about how he closed them. I remember standing in our kitchen, listening, smiling, watching him glow. And I didn't say, my father called each of those clients personally to vouch for you. I let him believe the version that made him taller. 6 months into our marriage, Caleb still couldn't raise capital. He pitched to dozens of investors, got polite smiles and firm no's. So, at a charity dinner, one with my college friends and their families, the kind of room where money floated in the air like perfume, I mentioned Caleb's company. Casually, strategically, I described it as promising. I said it was the kind of early opportunity people like to brag about later, and I watched faces shift. Not because Caleb had convinced them, because I had. Over the next 2 months, 4 fathers, men who ran investment firms, real estate companies, manufacturing businesses, reached out to Caleb. They invested between $50,000 and $100,000 each. Caleb called it his breakthrough. He told people the market believed in him. He didn't know that before the dinner, I had spent weeks coaching him on his pitch deck. And afterward, I had pulled those men aside and framed it as a favor to me. Not a discovery, a favor. With that money, Caleb finally looked like the man he wanted to be. He hired employees, moved into an office, started talking like he had arrived. But the marketing was still weak. His website looked amateur. His social media was basically non-existent. And I knew, because marketing was my world, that in business, a good product without visibility is a whisper in a stadium. Caleb couldn't afford a serious agency, so I paid for it myself. $80,000 over 18 months. Freelancers. Small agencies my father's firm had worked with. SEO. Content creation. Targeted ads. I even created a separate business email so the invoices didn't hit Caleb's company accounts. I remember the first time I saw the campaigns running, my own money fueling his growth. My stomach did this tight twist, because a part of me knew I was crossing into territory that wasn't healthy. But another part of me said, this is what partners do. This is marriage. And Caleb? Caleb saw the results. Traffic rising, leads coming in, customers signing up. And he thought it was organic growth because his product was superior. He never once asked me, how did this happen so fast? Because he didn't want the answer if it made him feel small. The company grew. He hired a sales team. Revenue climbed. And by our 4th anniversary, Caleb gave himself a significant salary increase like it was a trophy he had earned with blood. He bought a Tag Heuer watch, started talking about upgrading to a luxury car, joined an exclusive gym, took up golfing with other CEOs. And somewhere in that transition, somewhere between struggling founder and successful entrepreneur, his personality shifted like a mask turning into skin. He began making comments about my job, about me working at my father's firm, as if it was less impressive than what he had built. At dinner parties, he dominated conversations, preaching about sacrifice, about ambition, about what it meant to be self-made. And the first time I heard him say that word, self-made, something inside me went cold, because I knew exactly how many hands had held him up, how many times I had quietly placed stepping stones under his feet. And I realized he didn't just forget my contribution. He erased it, on purpose. But I still stayed. I still smiled. Because it's hard to admit you've built your own cage. And it's even harder to admit the person you married is starting to look at you like you're part of the furniture. And that's what set the stage for everything that happened later. Because by the time our 6th anniversary approached, the truth was already there, heavy, unspoken, sitting between us like a third person at every meal. Caleb didn't just believe he was the reason for his success. He believed I had no idea what success even was. And when a man starts to believe that about the woman who's been carrying him, he stops treating her like a partner. He starts treating her like an accessory. There wasn't a single moment where I could say, this is when it started going wrong. It was more like condensation forming on glass. Slow, invisible, inevitable if the temperature keeps dropping. The first sign was the way Caleb began correcting me in public. Not outright arguing, not openly dismissing, just small interruptions. Subtle enough that if I called them out, I'd sound oversensitive. At a dinner with his new investor friends, someone asked me what I did for work. Before I could answer, Caleb laughed lightly and said, she's in marketing, family business. Family business. He didn't mention my title, didn't mention that I led teams, didn't mention that I handled accounts larger than his entire annual revenue. I smiled anyway, because correcting him would have made things awkward, because I told myself it wasn't worth starting something over a word. But that word stayed with me. Family. Like I was playing house while he was building an empire. The second sign was how he talked about money. When he was struggling, money had been a shared problem. Something we discussed together, something we navigated as a unit. Once he started earning more, money became his domain. I suggested increasing our retirement contributions one Saturday morning. He was scrolling through photos of a Range Rover on his phone, zooming in on the leather interior like it was art. He didn't even look up when he said it. You don't understand what it's like to run a high-growth business. The words landed heavier than he intended. I tried to keep my voice calm. I pointed out that we were doing well now, that planning ahead was smart, that security didn't have to mean limitation. That's when he said it. You think small because you've never built anything yourself. I felt it in my chest first, a tightness, like my lungs had forgotten how to expand. I remember looking at his face, really looking, and realizing he believed it. He believed that because my path hadn't been chaotic, it wasn't legitimate. Because my foundation was solid, it didn't count as creation. I didn't argue. I just nodded and let the conversation die. But something in me shifted. I started paying closer attention. At a company event a few months later, I overheard him speaking to his employees. He was holding a drink, relaxed, confident, basking in their attention. He talked about the early days, about being broke, about hustling, about bootstrapping. He said, I built this with almost no help. I stood frozen near the edge of the room, my glass sweating in my hand. I waited for him to say my name, for him to mention any form of support. He didn't, And in that moment, I realized something painful but clarifying. Caleb wasn't forgetting my role. He was rewriting it. Every success story needs a narrative, and in his, there was only room for one hero. The third sign came from his family. His mother started making comments that mirrored his. Things like, "It must be nice to have a safety net," said with a smile that wasn't kind. Or, "Caleb really pulled himself up," as if I were some passive observer instead of his partner. I noticed how Caleb never corrected her, never once said, "Actually, she helped." Instead, he would squeeze my hand under the table in a way that felt more like a warning than affection, as if saying, "Don't make this uncomfortable." Even his friends changed. The men he golfed with, the ones who talked about exits and valuations and personal brands, started treating me like background noise. They would talk over me, ask Caleb questions about strategy, look surprised if I offered an insight that landed. One of them once said, "Wow, you really know your stuff," in a tone usually reserved for dogs who learn tricks. Caleb laughed. He didn't say, "Of course she does." He said, "Yeah, she picks things up." Picks things up. Like knowledge was something I absorbed passively, not something I had built deliberately. At home, the distance grew. Caleb stayed later at the office, went on trips I wasn't invited on, started framing his life like something separate from mine. He talked about my company instead of our future. He made jokes about founders needing wives who understand sacrifice, as if I hadn't sacrificed quietly for years. And still I stayed, because leaving over words felt dramatic. Because there was no affair, no smoking gun, no clear villain. Just erosion. Just the slow realization that the man I married no longer saw me as an equal. And then came our 6th anniversary. I booked the restaurant 3 months in advance. The place where we'd had our first date. The kind of restaurant that didn't rush you, where candlelight softened everything, where memories could almost be rewritten. I reminded him repeatedly. Casually at first, then more directly. He confirmed the day before, 7 o'clock. I bought a new dress, navy blue. Something elegant, but understated. Something that said, "I belong here." I arrived 10 minutes early. I sat down, and I waited. At 7:15, I texted. At 7:30, I checked my phone again. At 8, the waiter asked if I wanted to order. "I'm waiting for someone," I said, my voice too polite. By 8:30, I could feel people noticing. The couple at the next table avoided eye contact. The hostess smiled at me like she felt sorry. I went to the bathroom and stood in the stall, pressing my palm against my mouth, breathing through humiliation. By 9, I ordered a glass of wine just to have something in front of me. And by 10, he walked in, laughing, drunk, with 4 of his high school friends. That was the moment every small comment, every dismissal, every unspoken truth aligned into something undeniable. And I understood, with startling clarity, that this wasn't about him being late. It was about him believing I would always be waiting. The door swung open, and a burst of laughter cut through the low hum of the restaurant. I looked up instinctively, my heart doing that stupid, hopeful jump it still did back then. Like maybe there would be an apology, maybe there would be embarrassment, maybe he would rush toward me with that look that said, "I messed up, please forgive me." Instead, I saw Caleb surrounded by 4 men I recognized instantly, his high school friends, loud, flush, unsteady on their feet, the kind of drunk that spills outward, invading whatever space they enter. They were already halfway to our table when Caleb finally noticed me. He stopped short, blinked like he was surprised I was still there, then grinned. Not sheepish, not guilty, amused. "There you are," he said, dragging the words out as if I'd been hiding from him. His eyes flicked down my dress, then back up to my face. "You look like a lost puppy." His friends burst out laughing. The sound hit me physically. My hands went cold so fast it felt like someone had dumped ice water over them. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and uneven. I stood up slowly. "Where have you been?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to me, too steady, like it was coming from someone else. Caleb waved a hand dismissively, ran into the guys at a bar. Time got away from us. One of his friends clapped him on the shoulder and said something about shots and memories. Another pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the restaurant like it was a novelty. I glanced around. Other diners were openly staring now. No one pretended not to notice anymore. I opened my mouth to speak again, but Caleb leaned closer and lowered his voice just enough to feel intimate. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at me, the table, the candles. "This is payback." I frowned. "Payback for what?" His smile sharpened. "For that time you were late to meet me for a movie, remember? 2nd month we were dating." It took me a second to process. That had been 6 years ago. I'd been stuck at work. A client crisis. I'd texted him repeatedly, apologized, bought popcorn to make up for it, and he had forgiven me, or so I thought. I planned this, he continued, like he was proud. Figured you should know how it feels to wait. My stomach dropped. You planned to humiliate me? I asked quietly. His friends were still standing there, watching. One of them smirked. Another leaned in, like he didn't want to miss a word. Caleb shrugged. You're being dramatic. Relax. Kitchen's probably closed, but we can grab drinks. You can join us. One of his friends laughed and said, Marriage is over once you stop trying to impress your wife, right? More laughter. That was it. That was the exact moment something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not explosively, but cleanly, like a rope being cut. I looked at Caleb, not the founder, not the confident CEO, just a man who thought cruelty was clever, a man who believed I would swallow anything as long as he smiled afterward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I picked up my purse, pushed my chair back, and walked away. I heard Caleb call my name. I didn't turn around. The drive home was silent. No music, no tears. Just the sound of my own breathing and the realization settling in my chest like a weight finally finding the ground. When I got home, the house was empty. Caleb didn't come back until after midnight. He stumbled in, smelling like alcohol and sweat, dropped his shoes by the door, and collapsed into bed without a word. I lay there beside him, staring at the ceiling, every second stretching longer than the last. At around 2 a.m, I got up. I walked into my office, and I started making phone calls. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Because when someone shows you, clearly, publicly, that they do not respect you, the worst thing you can do is continue supporting the illusion that they deserve what you've been giving them. And that night, I finally stopped pretending. I didn't sleep. Not because I was crying or pacing or replaying the scene over and over like people imagine heartbreak looks like, but because my mind had gone eerily quiet. That kind of quiet is dangerous. It's the sound of a decision forming. I sat in my office with the door closed, the glow of my laptop casting long shadows across the room. The house felt unfamiliar, like I had wandered into someone else's life and was waiting for permission to leave. At some point, I noticed my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from restraint. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was reacting strategically. The first call I made was to James. It was late, but I knew he'd answer. We'd known each other since college. He was the kind of person who picked up when something mattered. He sounded groggy when he said hello. I need to call in a favor, I told him. There was a pause, then, okay, what's going on? I explained it plainly. No dramatics, no tears. I told him his father's investment in Caleb's company hadn't come from belief in the business. It had come from loyalty to me, that I had facilitated it, that I was now withdrawing my support. Silence stretched on the line. Then James exhaled. I wondered, he said quietly. That single sentence hit harder than any accusation. He told me he would speak to his father in the morning. I thanked him and hung up. I made 3 more calls that night. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Surprise, understanding, agreement. These men hadn't invested because they believed in Caleb's vision. They had invested because they trusted me. And now I was releasing them from that obligation. Then I called the marketing agency. I told them to stop everything, immediately. The ad campaigns, the SEO work, the content creation, all of it. I called the freelancers, the consultants, the people who had been quietly fueling Caleb's growth with my money. Every contract was canceled. Every invoice was closed. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. By the time the sun started to lighten the edges of the windows, my marriage and the machine that had propped up my husband's success was already unraveling. I spent the rest of the night documenting bank statements, transfers, receipts, spreadsheets detailing every dollar I had spent supporting his company over the years. $80,000. That number stared back at me like proof I couldn't unsee. I pulled up the prenup, the one Caleb had insisted on. No alimony, no claims to business assets. At the time, I had agreed without hesitation. I had my own income, my own career. I didn't need protection. Ironically, that document would make everything clean now. When Caleb woke up the next morning, the fallout began immediately. His phone rang while I was in the kitchen making coffee. I heard his voice through the walls, confused at first, then sharp with panic. What do you mean you're pulling out? He ended that call and another came in. Then another. By 10, he was pacing in the living room, his laptop open, refreshing analytics like the numbers might magically reverse themselves if he stared hard enough. The leads were gone. The ads had stopped overnight. Search rankings were slipping. The social accounts were quiet. He stormed into the kitchen, eyes wild. Do you know what's happening? He demanded. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering. I know exactly what's happening. I told him everything about the investors, about the favors, about the marketing money, about the years of support he had never acknowledged. I watched his face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something like fear. Then he exploded. He accused me of manipulation, of sabotage, of ruining his life because of one missed dinner. I let him yell. When he finally ran out of breath, I said calmly, "This isn't about the dinner. It was about 6 years of erasure, about being treated like I didn't understand business, my business, while quietly building his, about watching him turn my support into his mythology. You can rebuild," I told him, "the way you always said you did, on your own." Then I went upstairs and started packing. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing, and that made all the difference. I stayed at my parents' house for 2 weeks. Not because I couldn't afford somewhere else, not because I needed rescuing, but because I needed stillness. Space where the noise Caleb had filled my life with couldn't reach me. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. Caleb texted constantly at first. Angry messages, mostly. Long paragraphs accusing me of betrayal, of control, of destroying everything he had worked for. "You blindsided me. You had no right. You think you're smarter than everyone else." I read them once. Then I stopped opening them. By the fourth day, the tone shifted. The messages became shorter, more frantic. "Please undo this. We can talk." I'll admit I was wrong. But even then, he never apologized for the restaurant, never acknowledged the humiliation, never said he had disrespected me. He just wanted the machine back online. That told me everything. The escalation didn't come from Caleb alone. It came from the people around him. Mutual friends started calling, carefully at first, as if testing the temperature of the conversation. One told me what I did was unethical. Another said I had crossed a line by involving his business. "You should have just divorced him quietly," someone else said, like there was a polite way to leave a marriage built on erasure. I explained the same thing every time. I didn't destroy anything. I stopped building it. That distinction didn't land. In their version of events, Caleb was a founder brought down by a vindictive wife. Context didn't matter. History didn't matter. Only the spectacle did. And Caleb leaned into that narrative. I found out later that he had been telling people I was jealous of his success, that I couldn't stand being married to someone more accomplished than me. The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. His family was worse. His mother called me one evening, her voice tight with judgment. "You could have handled this like an adult," she said. "Marriage is about compromise." I asked her if compromise included being publicly humiliated on your anniversary. She didn't answer that. Instead, she told me I had embarrassed him. That was when I stopped explaining. I realized something important during that time. People who benefit from your silence will always call you cruel the moment you speak. Meanwhile, the consequences I had triggered were cascading faster than Caleb could contain them. The investors who withdrew left a gap he couldn't fill quickly. Without the marketing engine I had funded, growth stalled overnight. Revenue flattened, expenses didn't. He laid off 3 employees within weeks. I heard that through mutual friends, not from him, because by then, I had stopped being part of his life entirely. I found my own apartment 3 weeks after leaving, signed the lease myself, moved my things in one afternoon, chose furniture that felt like me, not us. Caleb filed for divorce 2 weeks after I left. I didn't contest it. The prenup made everything clean. No alimony, no claims beyond what we'd purchased together. When the paperwork came through, it felt strangely anticlimactic. Just signatures. Just ink. The real unraveling had already happened. But what surprised me most, what truly caught me off guard, was my father. He had always been cautious about Caleb, but he had never interfered. Never said, "I told you so." When I finally told him everything, the introductions, the investors, the marketing, he just nodded slowly. "I suspected," he said. That stunned me. He told me he never believed Caleb's version of his success story, that he'd watched how things aligned too neatly, too conveniently. And then he said something I didn't realize I needed to hear. "I'm proud of you for walking away when you realized the relationship was broken." Not when it was loud, not when it was dramatic. When it was quietly, fundamentally wrong. My mother wasn't as certain. She asked if I had been too harsh, if I should have given Caleb a chance to fix his behavior. I didn't argue with her. I just remembered the restaurant, the laughter, the planned humiliation. Some things don't need a second explanation. By the time the divorce papers were finalized, I had settled into a routine. Work, home, sleep. The loneliness crept in at night when the apartment felt too big and too quiet. But underneath it all, there was something new. Stability. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding anyone else up. And I didn't yet know it, but that shift, the removal of my weight from one collapsing structure, was about to expose another one that had been rotting for far longer. Because just as my marriage ended, a different truth was already preparing to surface. One that would force me to look at my family in a way I never had before. I thought the worst of it was over once the divorce papers were filed. That sounds naive now. At the time, I believed the hardest part of my life had been choosing myself over a marriage that hollowed me out. I believed the loneliness I felt at night, the quiet apartment, the empty side of the bed, was the price of freedom. I didn't know I was standing at the edge of a much deeper fall. 6 weeks after I moved into my apartment, my father called me in the middle of a workday. His voice was calm but strained in a way I had never heard before. "Can you come over tonight?" he asked. "I need to talk to you." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. When I arrived, he was sitting in his office at home, not behind his desk at the firm like usual. There was a cardboard box on the table between us, neatly labeled folders, documents stacked with deliberate care. He didn't offer me a drink. He didn't make small talk. He just said, "I was going to keep this private, but you deserve to know." Then he told me my mother had been having an affair. Over a year. The words didn't land all at once. They came in pieces, like shards that took time to register as pain. The man was her dentist, someone she had been seeing for routine appointments for years. Someone my father had greeted politely at school fundraisers and neighborhood events without knowing what was happening behind his back. My father discovered it by accident. She had left her phone on the kitchen counter. A message came through. Too familiar, too intimate, impossible to misunderstand. He said he stared at the screen for a long time before picking up the phone. He didn't yell. He didn't confront her right away. Instead, he waited. For 3 months, he documented everything. Hotel receipts disguised as spa days, credit card charges at restaurants he had never eaten at with her, text messages outlining meetups, complaints, jokes at his expense. While she was planning weekends away, he was planning his exit. As he spoke, I realized something horrifying. The same patterns, the same entitlement, the same rewriting of reality. My father had built his business over 30 years. Long hours, relentless discipline, sacrifice I had watched with my own eyes growing up. My mother had been there, but not in the way she now claimed. During those 3 months of silence, my father quietly transferred portions of ownership to me and to a business trust. He worked with lawyers to protect what he had built before ever confronting her. When he finally did, she didn't deny it. She told him she deserved passion. She said the marriage had become boring, that he was always working, that the dentist made her feel special. Listening to my father repeat her words made my chest ache in a way I couldn't fully explain. Because I had just left a man who used the same logic. "You didn't make me feel important enough." When my father told her he wanted a divorce, her tone changed instantly. Suddenly, she talked about sacrifice, about being a wife, about what she was owed. She demanded the house, the business, half of everything. She acted like the affair was a footnote. The divorce was ugly. She hired an aggressive lawyer, claimed she was entitled to the business, claimed she had supported it emotionally, that without her, it wouldn't exist. My father's lawyers responded with evidence, receipts, spending records, proof that while he had been building, she had been consuming. The court ruled largely in his favor. She received a settlement, but nowhere near what she demanded. The house stayed with him. The business stayed with him. And when she moved out, she moved in with the dentist. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. Because in the span of 1 year, I had watched my marriage implode and my parents' marriage disintegrate in the same way. Quiet entitlement, unacknowledged labor, rewritten narratives. It felt like betrayal was contagious. I started questioning everything. My judgment, my instincts, my ability to see people clearly. There were nights I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the common denominator, if I attracted people who thrived on my silence. Work became my refuge. I buried myself in client accounts, took on more responsibility, stayed late just to avoid the quiet. But the quiet followed me anyway. And at my lowest point, alone in an apartment I had chosen, surrounded by a freedom that felt heavier than chains, I wondered if I had burned too many bridges. If I had chosen strength too late. If walking away had cost me more than staying ever would have. That was the darkest moment. Not anger, not grief, but doubt. And it almost swallowed me whole. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic revelation, no single sentence that flipped a switch and turned the lights back on. It came quietly, through repetition, through patterns I could no longer unsee. It started with paperwork. A few days after my father told me about the affair, I stopped by his office to drop off some documents. While he was on a call, I sat alone in the conference room, flipping through old folders he had pulled out during the divorce proceedings. Contracts, financial statements, early business plans. And then I noticed something, my name, not just once, not in passing, over and over again. Early agreements where I had been listed as an advisor. Email threads from years ago where my strategic suggestions were incorporated almost word for word into proposals. Notes in the margins, my handwriting about positioning, client retention, long-term brand value. I sat there, fingers resting on the paper, feeling something steady click into place. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was contribution. For years, I had been minimizing my role, telling myself I was helping, supporting, assisting. But looking at those documents, I saw the truth with uncomfortable clarity. I didn't just help build other people's lives. I built them. And I had let them convince me that doing so quietly made it less real. That realization followed me home. That night, I reread Caleb's personal statement, the letter his lawyer had attached to the divorce paperwork, the one where he accused me of controlling him, of pretending to support him while secretly pulling strings. For the first time, I didn't feel defensive. I felt detached, because I could see it now. People who benefit from your labor but never acknowledge it will always call you manipulative the moment you stop. The next turning point came from an unexpected place. One of my father's longtime clients, a woman who ran a manufacturing company, asked me to lunch. We'd worked together for years, but always professionally. This time felt different. Over salads and iced tea, she looked at me and said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I don't want a polite answer." I waited. "Why are you still working under your father's shadow?" The question startled me. I started to deflect, talking about loyalty, family, timing. She cut me off gently. "You don't stay late because you have to," she said. "You stay because you care. You don't lead accounts because you're assigned them. You lead because people trust you." Then she leaned forward. "You're not supporting other people's visions. You are the vision." I went home and cried. Not out of sadness, out of relief, because for the first time in a long time, someone had reflected back to me the version of myself I had been shrinking to keep others comfortable. That was the moment I decided to stop shrinking. I stopped questioning whether I had handled things too harshly. I stopped replaying the restaurant scene looking for alternative outcomes. I stopped wondering if I owed Caleb or my mother one more chance to explain themselves. Some people don't need more chances. They need fewer enablers. I met with my lawyer and finalized the last of the divorce details without hesitation. No bargaining, no emotional concessions. I had already given enough. And when my father asked, carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed, to start training me to take over the business one day, I didn't hesitate. I said yes, not because it was expected, but because it was earned. The power shift wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about watching anyone fail. It was about finally recognizing that I didn't need to prove my worth by holding everyone else together. I could choose myself, and that choice changed everything that followed. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rolled in slowly, like a tide that doesn't announce itself until you realize the shoreline has disappeared beneath your feet. I didn't watch Caleb's world collapse from a front row seat. I didn't stalk his social media or ask mutual friends for updates. I found out the way you do, when lives overlap just enough to leak information. Through half-finished sentences, awkward pauses, people lowering their voices like they were sharing gossip they weren't sure I deserved to hear. The investors didn't come back. Not one of them. The gap they left was bigger than Caleb wanted to admit. He tried to pitch new backers, tried to spin the story, tried to frame the withdrawals as strategic restructuring. But without momentum, without growth, without the polished machine I had funded and orchestrated, the cracks were obvious. Within weeks, he laid off 3 employees, out of 8. I heard that number and felt something complicated twist in my chest. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just a sober understanding of cause and effect. This was what his company looked like without my hands steadying the wheel. His family turned colder too. His mother, who had once lectured me about compromise, stopped calling entirely. I heard she was telling people I had used my father's influence to punish her son. That version of the story traveled well. It fit neatly into people's need for simple villains. And for a while, many believed it. But stories have a way of thinning out when they're not supported by reality. Caleb's confidence, the loud, performative kind, began to falter. Without growth to point to, without wins to broadcast, the bravado rang hollow. Friends who had crowded around him when success looked shiny started drifting away. Dinners stopped. Invitations dried up. Even his high school friends, the ones who had laughed in that restaurant, weren't around as much. I heard he complained about them not understanding the pressure, about people disappearing when things got hard. I recognized the irony immediately. At the same time, my own life was settling into something quieter. Not easier, just clearer. I went to work every day and handled accounts with a focus I hadn't had in years. I stopped apologizing for being decisive. I stopped softening my opinions so they'd land more gently. Clients responded. Colleagues leaned in. When my father stepped back more intentionally, the firm didn't wobble. It didn't stall. It moved, and people noticed. My mother's fallout was louder. After moving in with the dentist, his name was Gregory, she posted photos online like she was performing happiness. New beginnings, fresh starts, smiling captions that didn't reach her eyes. It lasted 3 weeks. Gregory, it turned out, hadn't signed up to bankroll a lifestyle. He made good money, but not that kind of money. When my mother started expecting luxury trips and expensive dinners as baseline, they fought. Then he ended it. She called me the next day. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, unsteady. She asked if she could come over. I said no. She cried, told me she was my mother, that I owed her at least a conversation. I don't owe you anything, I said, and ended the call. 2 days later, she showed up at my father's office. Security escorted her out. She screamed in the lobby about betrayal, about how my father had ruined her life and turned me against her. Watching the fallout from a distance, I felt something shift again. Not cruelty. Closure. My father filed for a restraining order. He was tired, not angry, tired. He told me he wanted peace, not drama. He wanted to hike, to work with his hands again, to live a life that wasn't built around managing someone else's entitlement. He started dating a woman named Patricia. She owned a catering company. She laughed easily. She didn't ask him for anything. When I met her, I understood immediately why he liked her. She stood on her own. As the months passed, the narrative around Caleb thinned. Some people still believed his version. Others quietly stopped bringing it up. The louder his accusations became, the less weight they carried. And me? I walked away without revenge, without speeches, without public explanations, because the truth didn't need defending. It was already doing its work. I left a marriage calmly. I left a role that required my silence. And I watched from a distance as the structures that relied on my invisibility learned what it felt like to stand without it. The quiet didn't disappear. It changed. At first, it had felt hollow, like the echo left behind when something collapses and you're still standing in the dust. I would come home to my apartment, set my keys on the counter, and feel the absence of another presence like a question with no answer. But slowly, almost without my noticing, the silence softened. It became mine. 4 months after the divorce was finalized, my life no longer felt like something I was recovering from. It felt like something I was building, intentionally, deliberately, without asking anyone for permission. My mother's situation continued to unravel. After Gregory ended their relationship, she bounced between friends who tolerated her for weeks at a time before asking her to leave. She expected to be supported, to be accommodated, to be rescued. When that didn't happen, she grew bitter. She's living now in a small apartment, funded by what's left of her settlement. The money is going quickly. Old habits die slowly when entitlement has never been challenged. She tried to contact my father again, asking for more money, threatening to tell her side of the story publicly if he didn't help. His response was simple. His lawyer sent a cease and desist letter. The restraining order was approved after she violated it once. She hasn't tried again. As for my father, he looks lighter these days. He spends evenings woodworking. He hikes on weekends. He talks about traveling, about seeing the world now that he's no longer carrying someone else's dissatisfaction on his back. And at work, he's been training me. Not symbolically, not gradually in a way that delays responsibility. Really training me. We have long conversations about strategy, about legacy, about what the firm should become after he steps back. He's planning a transition over the next few years. And when he talks about it, there's pride in his voice. Not obligation. Pride. Caleb has faded into the background of my life. I haven't spoken to him since the divorce. I heard, through a former mutual friend, that he's dating one of the employees who stayed on after the layoffs, that he tells people his ex-wife sabotaged him out of jealousy. That story doesn't bother me anymore. People believe the version of events that protects them from asking harder questions. And I no longer need their approval. My own life has settled into a rhythm that feels honest. I work long hours, but they're my hours, spent on problems I'm good at solving. I come home to an apartment I chose, furnished with things that reflect me, paid for with money I earned. I take weekend trips alone. I explore small towns. I sit in cafes without checking my phone every 5 minutes. The silence no longer feels like loss. It feels like space. Looking back, I understand now that this was never about one dinner, or one argument, or even one marriage. It was about what happens when a woman's labor is treated as invisible, and what happens when she finally removes it. I didn't destroy anyone's life. I stopped holding it together for them. My mother lives with the consequences of her choices. My ex-husband runs the company he claimed he built alone. My father is building a life rooted in peace. And I am exactly where I should be. No longer shrinking, no longer apologizing, no longer waiting to be chosen. There was no thunderous ending, no dramatic reconciliation. Just people living with what they built and what they destroyed. The ledger balanced itself, and my phone stays silent. That's how this story ends.